people typically exist within cultural constructs that are very, very ancient and that are grounded in evolved systems of meaning that are even deeper than the ones that are articulated and explicit. Lots of times people come to me and they have relationship problems, and part of the problem is that they've set their relationships up outside of social norms. And they do that, so they'll say to me something like, well, we are not going to get married because marriage is just a piece of paper, which is really a stupid thing to say. Like, it's an incredibly stupid thing to say. But underneath that, there's this idea that they want to remain free of social constraints so that they can negotiate their own way. Like, if you're giving them credit for, wanting freedom instead of just escaping responsibility. But the problem with that is, it's like, okay, good luck. Try it. I don't know why you would assume that you have enough time in the 30 or 40 years that you're going to be pursuing relationships to actually figure out how they should run. You don't have a hope of that. And it's worse, too, because very, very few people can negotiate. Because here's the way it works. You either adhere to the social order or you stand outside of it. As soon as you stand outside of it, you're in a chaotic place because there's no guidelines. And then you either live chaotically because there's no guidelines, or you start to formulate order. But to do that, you have to know what you want. And you have to know how to express it. And then you have to figure out what your partner wants and help them express it, and then you have to negotiate a solution. Well, I would say 1 in 20 people know how to negotiate. It's really, really difficult. I mean, just think of the steps. First of all, you have to know what you want, and then you have to admit it to yourself. Well, yeah, right. Like, you're not even going to get to the first one in all likelihood. What do you want? A lot of what you want can't be articulated even, I'll give you an example. So, there's a great study done a while back on the prediction of relationship longevity. Okay, so here was the question. How many positive interactions per negative interaction do you have to have with your partner in order for the relationship to remain stable? Okay, so let's say you have 1 negative interaction to every 1 positive interaction, okay? Or maybe you have 10 negatives to every positive. Then you can imagine a different situation where you have 100 positive to 1 negative, right? Spanning the whole potential continuum. And you use that to predict relationship satisfaction and longevity. Well, you might think, well, God, obviously 100 positive to 1 negative is the preferable ratio. And so it's those people who, their relationship is nothing but constant compliments and bliss. They're the ones who last. It's not true. What you see is that there's an optimal ratio domain. If it falls below 5 to 1 positive to negative, then your relationship falls apart. It's too negative. And it's partly because people feel negative emotion more than they feel positive emotion. Because you can be hurt more than you can be pleased. And so one that's only 5 to 1 is too punishing. And people won't stay in it. But if you get above 11 to 1, it gets not punishing enough. And you think, well, what does that mean exactly? Well, what do you want in a relationship? Well, you think, bliss. It's like, that isn't what you want, as it turns out. It's more like you want someone to contend with. You don't want to push over. You don't want everything just to be easy. And this is the sort of phenomenon that Kierkegaard was talking about when he talked about deciding to make things more difficult for people because that's what they need. You know this perfectly well, because if you go out with someone and they worship you and they dote on your every word and there's nothing but positive feedback coming from them, you lose respect for them almost instantly, and you go wander off and find someone who's more interesting. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that you want the person that you're with to challenge you, so that not only do you do reasonably well day together, so that you can coexist in the same space with a reasonable amount of peace, but you also want there to be enough tension in the relationship so that you're both involved in a process of mutual transformation. Well, try specifying that in an articulated way. Good luck. And it also explains strange things about people, like the fact that they'll stay in pretty negative relationships. Like, what the hell are you doing there? If you'd articulated it 2 years ago and you said, well, I want to be with someone I'm miserable with half the time, Of course, you're never going to say that, but it could easily be that that's what you're after. So, well, in periods of very rapid technological and cognitive transformation, because those things go together, the certainties upon which people base their interpretation of the world, and even more importantly, base their judgments about how to act, start to become uncertain. And when there's a period of very, very rapid cognitive and technological change, then the integrity of those systems starts to become questionable from an explicit perspective, but it also starts to become insufficient from a practical perspective. So, for example, if you introduce the birth control pill into a population and you put women's reproductive faculties under their own voluntary choice, then you radically transform virtually all of society's fundamental social structures, not least marriage. And marriage, of course, is being regarded classically as the foundation of civilization. And, of course, increasingly, there are more people who aren't married than there are people who are married. Now, it's very difficult to know what to make of that because, of course, there's no setting the clock back. And it's not even clear that you would want to set back the clock if you could. But expecting cultural constructs which take centuries or maybe even thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of years to develop to keep up with change of that magnitude it's not possible. And you guys face technological transformations that are earth-shattering on an almost yearly basis and you hardly even notice it. I mean, Tinder is a good example of that. It's a radical technology because it's the first technology that's ever been invented that enables men to find partners with virtually no fear of rejection. And of course, that's been a limiting factor that's been a defining feature of the interactions between men and women ever since history began. And so these things are occurring at an extraordinary rate. And of course, it's not reasonable to expect our more slower moving cultural constructs to keep up with them. During periods of rapid transformation, it's hard for the social contract to adjust itself so that everyone knows how to behave in relationship to one another, but then it's also very difficult for the description of that, so the articulated norms that constitute a society, it's very difficult of them to transform rapidly enough so that they can keep track of the changes and help people decide what they should do. Let me give you an example. So I had a client a while back who had been raised as a fundamentalist Christian. She had been socialized and had come to believe that sex before marriage was wrong, but the probability that she was going to get married before she was 27 or 28 was low for a whole variety of reasons, and so then she faced this conundrum. It was quite obvious to me that a lot of the constraints that had been placed on her behavior as a consequence of her relatively rigid belief were actually interfering with her development as a person. And so one of the things we had to puzzle out was, well, exactly what are the moral guidelines that you should use to regulate your sexual behavior outside of marriage if you're not planning to be married for, maybe until your late 20s? Well, good luck trying to figure that out. It's a really, really complicated question. And it's certainly not obvious that any one person can figure out the answer to that in a single lifetime, even if they thought of nothing else, especially because the landscape itself is transforming as you're attempting to adjust to it. And we eventually concluded, although it was a very individual solution, we eventually concluded that there were things that she had forbidden herself to do that were stopping her from establishing any kind of long-term relationship at all, and that was interfering with her development, as a mature person, and that the morality that she had used to structure her behavior appeared to be counterproductive, at least in some areas. So it's one thing to regulate sexuality in the hopes of marriage when you get married when you're 19 or 20 or 21. It's a completely different thing when it's perhaps not going to happen until you're in your late 20s.